Thank you so much, Dr. Sachs. That was a very engaging and warm felt and light humored towards the end, and I appreciate that. I'd like to welcome you to join the screen if you're able to do so. And I know we have a opportunity here for some questions and answers with you. So again, thank you so much. Hope you're doing well today. All right, so I have a couple of questions already that have been coming into us from our audience, and I just want to welcome the audience to continue to type in your questions. We'll get through as many as possible, and I'm going to make sure I keep myself on track a little bit with time. But so I think this first question here really grabs my attention, and it's sort of a bigger kind of conceptual question, Carolyn. And if you could talk to us on this relationship between your conception of feminist food justice and how that might intersect with the burgeoning and growing conversation around intersectionality, and particularly as to how it may relate to our current conversations as we see between food security and food sovereignty. So it's kind of a two-part question. You can take that wherever you like, but I think if we just start with the idea around feminist food justice and intersectionality, and I think there's a lot to really unpack there. So we'd just love to get your thoughts, and that might be a great place to get us going.
Yeah, thank you, everyone, and good morning. It's funny that this feels so live compared to the other presentation, which I had recorded a few weeks ago. So it feels nice to see real people to be talking to. So yes, I think that's a really good question, and I didn't emphasize it. When I was watching my talk, I didn't emphasize it as much as I had hoped to. But I think really we have built this whole idea of feminist food justice it has intersectionality at the center of it, and intersectionality in terms of having justice for women, people of color, queer, LGBT, farmers, and workers, and people, especially immigrants and people who don't have citizenship. So with the idea of feminist food justice is I think radically intersectional, and I really appreciated the conversation yesterday from I think Jemima, and also from Mary Peabody, focusing on intersectionality. And this has been kind of a theoretical shift, in women and gender studies. This has been going on for many years, but I think we really need to bring it to the development area too. And even though it's been a conversation and theory, I think that this whole conference is going from theory to the field. So how do you take this, theoretical idea of intersectionality to development is important work that we all have to do.
Absolutely, thank you. Perhaps to that last point, the second part of that question may be one way to think about that into taking it into the field. What's your understanding of this current conversation between food security and food sovereignty, and how does your conception of feminist food justice sort of help inform that conversation and then help inform us? Because you mentioned food sovereignty quite clearly in your presentation. So I think that's one of those major narratives that we're kind of working through right now, and love to see how you are intersecting with that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think we, in some other work I've done, where it's trying to compare like food security with food sovereignty with this new idea of feminist food justice. And I think food security, the whole concept of food security has, really been led a lot by FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and they've expanded their idea of food security from just production to looking at broader issues of food security. But it doesn't look so much at justice issues compared to the concept of food sovereignty. And the concept of food sovereignty really came out of grassroots organizations, as I mentioned, although I don't know anybody I know people couldn't see the slide. I don't know what happened for those first slides, but it did work when we originally had done it. So, but I think the concept food sovereignty is not just a concept, but it's a worldwide social movement, especially of indigenous people in Latin America, but it's spread all over the world with the idea that people will have control of the food that they eat. It's really anti-industrial agriculture, anti-globalization, and has some very important aspects to it. But my critique of it is that, and I raise this issue, is that they really are supporting small scale, very small scale farmers. And so many of these small scale farms are, as many of us know, very patriarchal, and how you support small scale farms and gender equity is a tough way to go. So I think it's important, and I support all their efforts, but I just want to bring gender equity more front and center to our work.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think that the notion of food sovereignty, our guiding star, helps us do that more readily if we clearly think about equity as core values. So I appreciate you articulating that for us.
Thanks, Ken.
Yeah, absolutely. We have several more questions that have come in, so I want to make sure we get to them. So I'm looking to my screen, so those of you who are looking why I'm looking over here. All right, so let's tackle this question. To what degree and in what ways do you think it is possible for women and other marginalized farmers in the United States and other parts of the world to be in solidarity with one another? And could you please maybe share an example?
Yeah, I think it's very possible for women to be in solidarity. Obviously, I mean, as the intersectionality approach tells us, and also I guess a lot of feminist theory too, is that there are many differences between women farmers in different parts of the world, and even women farmers in the U.S. As Mary Peabody mentioned yesterday, there's huge differences between them. And then you look at the difference between women farmers in the U.S. and women farmers in other parts of the world. So, for example, I think I had used the model that we had, the Women's Agricultural Network in Pennsylvania, and we use this model of working with women who are teaching other women how to farm and how to be in solidarity with each other. And we used some of the ideas from that when we were working in Honduras with AMIR, which is an indigenous women's group who has worked for quite a while on, they've worked for quite a long time on issues of equity and empowerment for women. And they've tried to pull this into the food system where they have a very small scale vegetable and fruit production facility. And so what we tried to do, and it was pretty interesting, it worked pretty well, thanks to the very hard work of Alfredo Reyes and Hazel, his colleague, where we had this farmer field school, and we do something on, say, drip irrigation, and then we do something on women's leadership at the same day. And we had these for 16 weeks, and we worked very closely with this women indigenous organization. And so I think that we brought the ideas together, and it actually worked pretty well. So that was kind of exciting.
Thank you for those. The local global intersection in your answer. I think that's.
We also, I should say, started a Cambodia Women's Agriculture Network that focused on small scale vegetable production, but we didn't really have a very good collaborate. We had a good university collaborator there, but we didn't have as strong of a women's organization to work with that had such deep inroads into the community and trust of the women. So it didn't quite take off as well as Honduras. So I think a key point here is working closely with local and community level organizations and linking those up, because when those people meet each other, it can really make it.
Yeah, appreciate that. And it's, I think we warmly appreciate acknowledging when some of our efforts are sometimes foiled for the obvious reasons of getting rooted into our communities. And I think that's those are good lessons to be had for all of us. Well, we have some more questions, and we have one here from Amanda Crump, and I'm going to read this out loud. There's a couple different parts to it, but I think this will be a good one. So I want to. Amanda offers thanks. So Carolyn, as always, thanks for being a champion of all. All along the food system, marginalized people are subject to discrimination that perpetuates the norms of the dominant people in power. Critical theory requires us to change norms, but I feel like the ways we challenge norms are very slow. How do we make radical change? How do we get to be more radical? That's the question.
Amanda asked that question. Yeah, I mean, like I said, when I concluded that my whole talk with, I had done the talk, and then I concluded it with those couple lines of the poem from Adrienne Rich, which had been written, I don't know what year she wrote it in, I have to say, but I just thought, oh my God, we're still having to confront these issues and of hunger even more so. And I think you just have to keep fighting. You just have to keep fighting and pushing for more radical ideas, and realize that the most radical ideas probably aren't going to happen soon, but if you just keep pushing and pushing and work in solidarity, and I think across different groups, and I think this whole notion of intersectionality can really help us there, instead of just working, just women working for women, African Americans working for African Americans, queer people working for queer people, of thinking of how we can have solidarity by taking an intersectional approach. So hopefully that's much more radical than some of the approaches that we've been taking. And I think that Jemima's emphasis too, and I think, USAID and other organizations are really talking about doing gender transformative work, which is, I think, also important and then the other issue that they raised, that Jemima raised too, is bringing men and boys into to making the change.
Excellent, thank you. I can see how these your ideas are truly coming together for us to think about what that feminist food justice really is as a practice.
Oh, and Amanda, please say hi to your mother for me.
Excellent. Wonderful. Well, I'm going to move on to, we have a couple more questions. We will have one here from Elise Hasselstein. Can you elaborate more on the contradiction of promoting gender equality simultaneously promoting the traditional family farm? Have you received any criticism for this? And I think that's really kind of, you mentioned earlier in your talk about there's recognizing ways in which gender is in performance on, in every day, from care work to on farm, work, but it's then how do we not reinscribe those traditional farm roles? And so perhaps you can talk to us more about what contradictions might be there, what kind of tensions there are living there for you, and have you received any criticism for those types of articulations?
Yeah, I wonder who asked that question, because actually I just read this chapter, and one of the people who read it said, I don't agree with this. I don't agree with this idea that traditional family farms are all patriarchal, that, and cited especially indigenous farms as not necessarily patriarchal. But I all the other things that the person who criticized me for, I changed, but this I said, no, I'm still holding to this idea that, but what the other thing is I have worked with some of my other colleagues we publish a book on women in sustainable agriculture in the US. And we've did extensive research, especially in the Northeast US, interviews, focus groups, surveys on women farmers. And we did find some changes that are happening on farms, with women taking more of an active role on the farm and not just viewing themselves as farm wives. And I know Angie Carter is going to speak later, and she's done a lot of work too with the Women Food and Agricultural Network, and trying to empower women, especially women who have inherited farms, and then how they can have some control over what happens on their farm. So I don't know if that's getting at your question enough. And the other issue I had was there were sort of two issues. One, the tradition, how to support small scale farming without supporting patriarchal farms, but also how we deal with this issue of supporting women's care work without reinscribing their roles. And I mean, this has become so, every day in the Washington Post and the New York Times, there's these huge articles about what's happening to women, especially they're focusing in the US, but it's happening worldwide during COVID, where women are just overburdened with all the responsibilities of care work and trying to feed their families in times where they might have been food insecure before, but it's just very, very difficult. So I think that obviously we need more policies at the government levels of all governments, not just the US government, but at other governments too, for feeding families and not just relying on women to do the work. Having boys and men take more responsibility for care work is starting to inch up a tiny bit, but just a tiny bit. So much more work needs to be done there. And I mentioned the Promundo organization that is trying to encourage men and boys to do care work. But, that's going back to Amanda's question, that's not going to be that radical. It's going to be just step by step, inch by inch, I'm afraid to say.
Well, thank you for, unpacking some of the, you see these very complicated, tensions that are rooted in some of these, and particularly if we want to become more radicalized in our policy work, but we're going to inherently fall into these spaces. And so I appreciate you offering that opportunity for us today. We also have a couple more questions, and I'm going to, Maggie Hartman asked early on, are gender responsive participatory research methods a viable way of understanding intersectional inequalities in our food systems? And if so, how are these methods being presently used? So I'd be curious to talk about more methodologically in our work, perhaps both praxis as well as in research projects, but are gender responsive participatory research methods a viable way of understanding intersectional inequalities?
Yeah, I'm offered, participatory research, participatory research methods, but I think that, I think that a number of people, especially, I would suggest looking at the work of Beena Agarwal. I think probably most people know her work, but she's shown how sometimes participatory research methods don't include the poorest of the poor people. You go to a village, go to a village, for example, work with the women there, but that oftentimes some of the most marginalized people aren't included in those participatory efforts, and because they're not really seen as important in the community. So I think to be especially aware of how you can reach the poorest, most vulnerable people in communities, because there might be very different interests, as I think Beena has shown very clearly, between women and the poorer women in a village and the more advantaged people. And also the work of Nightingale is really good too. Some interesting work in Nepal on differences between women. So I think in our participatory work, you have to be very attentive to what some of the inequalities and inequities are and how they cross these different lines. And I think that Jemima was talking about some of those things yesterday too.
Thank you, appreciate that. Absolutely. All right, we have a couple more. We're just coming on in here, so this is great. All right, so I'm going to go to Becky Williams. Moving to a different part of the conversation. Where do you see the role of the degrowth movement in the gender and food justice conversation? So kind of I know you didn't speak to degrowth in your talk, but perhaps this might be one of those intersectional radical spaces that we could talk about.
Yeah, I like that idea. I don't know that much about the degrowth movement. I just know a little bit. So I think I probably should look into that more and fit that into this feminist food justice. So certainly, I think we have to address issues around climate change, and so we've written some about that as well. So I can't say much more to that, but I would like to know more about how somebody sees that fitting into this feminist food justice.
Excellent. A reason for someone to submit a paper and continue the conversation. Absolutely. Great, thank you. All right, so we have a couple more, and make sure I get to those. So we have a question going kind of back to food sovereignty. So someone's offering their thanks to you. So Margaret Vanderberg, thanks Carolyn. Food sovereignty might require also to have us facilitating various food traditions in national, regional, and local cultures and contexts. Does it mean we need food justice support for allowing minorities, example, immigrants, refugees, etc., to gain land use, their food grown or imported, which might conflict with ecological sound, agricultural trade. Do you have any ideas how we can balance that?
That's some question.
That's a question. Yeah, I think you can intersect with that, however makes sense to you. Yeah, there's a lot there in terms of, I think we're trying to unpack here food sovereignty in terms of intersecting with, a global economic, transnational system that's not going away anytime soon.
Right.
So what do we do about that intersection, and how do we really breathe life into the food justice conversation when we have to address transnational global capitalism, for example? So have any solutions for us, Carol?
I don't have a solution. I would want to say thing that I just found very inspiring in reading the work of Monica White and some other people who've worked on the food justice movement, where one of the major issues that they're having is trying to get land for Black farmers, both in the cities and in the rural areas. But it's so amazing because they're so attentive to, they want to get land because they've been disenfranchised from land, and also many of them have never been, had land, but they're very attentive to the fact that the land will never really belong to them, that the land belongs, the land is from the indigenous people. It's not going to be their land. And it's so different than the way small scale, it's so different than the way so many smaller scale, white farmers approach land ownership and access to land. And I think many of us now are realizing this about the indigenous lands. But I've just been so impressed with how the Black farmers movements have paid great attention to indigenous people's rights too.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't answer that whole question, but it's just an example of.
Yeah, I think you brought that back. It's nice to even back to earlier questions about how can we have solidarity? How are we imagining and actually putting into practice what does intersectional food justice and intersectional feminist food justice look like? I'm just speaking from our work here in Virginia, which has, as you might imagine, lots of historical politics around land.
Oh, yes.
This is, and those kinds of conversations are coming from our frontline communities. And that, but to do it with the critique of what this question was about, the globalized, transnational, white supremacist, patriarchal, capitalist system. We can't just reimagine it without having to reimagine what that should be. How do we critique it, and how do we then redo it while we're doing it? If you know what I mean.
Well, that's why, that's why Anouk and I really came up with this idea that feminist food justice, it needs to go beyond just dealing with small scale farmers. It needs to look at the whole industrial food system. And if you're going to have food justice, you have to have justice for, like we've seen what's happened with the food processing workers, with the grocery store workers, especially during this pandemic. And so that it is important, and I'm all for
Hi everybody, Rusty
and small farmers and the food sovereignty movement. But I think given the widespread nature of industrial agriculture, we need to look at these other players and workers in the food system as well, and have some solidarity there, which isn't an easy task.
But here we are having a good conversation and thinking hard about that work. So appreciate that. All right, we have a couple more questions, and we have not quite 10 minutes, but we'll see if we can get a few more in here. All right, so you mentioned this a few times, and this is a great, I think, a way to open up this space. How can we bridge the gender gap between men and women when dealing with post-harvest losses and improving food security? So I think this notion of like, where does the role of men and women in come together, as well as when we're dealing specifically with perhaps harvest losses, but maybe it's even more largely defined around when there's vulnerabilities in the food system itself, right? And harvest loss is one of those vulnerabilities.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think another thing that I've written about before is the closer food gets to the table, the more likely it is to be women's work, and so I think in many parts of the world, a lot of the post-harvest work, saving the seeds in many places is women's work. Whether it's saving the seeds for grain cook in the family, or deciding what seeds are going to be saved to grow the next year. Oftentimes the women are the ones who are doing this. And there have been a number of development projects on post-harvest losses. And so I think that's a really important point in terms of food security, because if you can reduce post-harvest losses, obviously you can reduce food insecurity. So that, I think that has a huge gender dimensions to it. I don't know if that gets at the answer exactly, but.
I appreciate that, though. Right.
I've worked in Peru on projects a while ago where we were studying root and tuber crops, not just potatoes, but other crops. And there, women were the ones who were completely responsible for saving and storing the potatoes and deciding what would be eaten and what would be saved for next year. But oftentimes they don't have any, they know how to do it. They've been doing it. The knowledge gets passed down, but there haven't been that many projects that have tried to focus on how to improve that post-harvest loss.
No, thank you for the example. I think that definitely answers the question. I think depends on how much conversation we have, we might have time for one, maybe two more questions. So I'm gonna bring this question in from Norris Big. Thank you for this great conversation. In some countries like Afghanistan, where Virginia Tech is implementing the project, the farmers there are so poor that impacting both genders. small land ownership, and not having resources to get them out of poverty. Do you think without any major work or support, these people will ever get out of the situation? So I think it's talking about sort of the underlying support structures that are required for projects that you're describing, particularly as we think about multitude of genders and how they're involved in those opportunities.
Yeah, I think, I'll go back to what, I think what Hazel's worked on the Women Empowerment Index, and I think Jemima was talking about it too. So a lot of I think what they've done with the Women's Empowerment Index, there's also, to do that kind of research, they've also done, every men in the household get interviewed as well, and realizing that it's not just women who are women farmers who are disempowered, but it's also men farmers who are poor farmers who are also disempowered. So there might be inequities in the household, but it doesn't necessarily mean that men have power. So I think, some of these development approaches to poverty, I think as Jemima reminded us yesterday, there have been all these conceptual frameworks and different ways to look at it, but we haven't gotten nearly as far as we want to get. So I think we just have to keep plugging away at this and use some of our gender sensitive frameworks as we go forward.
Thank you. So we have a question by Winnie, which I think ties into some of the other issues that we've been exploring so far. Women farmers assessing the global market has been a problem unless middlemen, which I'm not sure if that's a play on words, are involved, and if you find their rights have been violated, especially from where I come from in Kenya. I'd like to hear more, maybe some thoughts you have, Carolyn, about this very, very complex space around ensuring that women farmers have access to this global market, and one, and two, if so, what kind of role we have intermediaries who are making that market accessibility possible, and making sure that women's rights are being they're being seen and heard and not being violated. So I'm not sure if you've any experience with those kinds of projects, or what you've seen on the ground, or what you've written about in that context.
Yeah, actually, I don't know if I working with a student of mine, I think she's here, Elizabeth Garner. I haven't been able to look and see who else is here, but she's working in Ghana, and she's been looking at some interesting work on USAID and Feed the Future and a number of other organizations are working very hard to try to encourage women to be more involved in the market and have access to global markets. But I think, for example, what she's finding in Ghana is that when farmers start producing for the global market, or even the urban large markets in Ghana, that's men are much more likely to sort of take over the marketing. And so I think that's something that we really have to look at, because I think those of us, many people I hear probably are funded by USAID or other organizations to do their, and even the CGIAR system too. They're all promoting markets as getting women access to markets as the key to women's empowerment and improving their positions. But women getting access to these global commodity markets is very, very difficult. And as Elizabeth is finding, I don't want to uptake her. She hasn't published this yet. But I think she's finding that, the access to land, the kind of crops they grow, being in these patriarchal households is really, kept them from getting the access to the kind of markets that they could, even though there's a whole history in Western Africa of women being the main market people.
Mm-hmm. And to add to that, so thank you. I think you addressed that question very, very well. And perhaps to add is, do you find there are tensions with the notion to begin with that to encourage women empowerment is in fact by way of addressing and getting access to global markets.
Yeah, I think it's problematic. I mean, and I think that's one of the things the food sovereignty movement has really focused on is, that instead of trying to produce for global markets, local communities and indigenous groups should be providing their own subsistence and producing more for local markets. And we even have this whole local food movement in the US too. So I guess the question is, what level of market should people aspire to be in? And the global industrial food system goes for the farmers who are making the most money are producing commodities for the global market. But I think we can, as Amanda suggests, be more radical and try to come up with other strategies as well. Something between food sovereignty and local food, and feminist food justice gives us a framework to think about.
Well, we are at time, and I couldn't think of a better way to conclude our conversation. That was just an excellent response to tying these very, very important and very complicated issues together. So, which is hence why we have to have conceptual frameworks like feminist food justice. So,
well, Kim, thank you so much for being such a great moderator. You've really brought out some key issues. I think that these issues we don't know, many of them we don't know the answer to. So I'm raising some of these issues because I don't know the answer. And I just think if all of us here can be thinking about it and be in conversation with each other, we'll be able to move forward.
Absolutely. Well, I have such gratitude for you today and for all of your work. And I just looking forward to, if you already haven't, the book's over on my shelf over here. I would grab it and show it, but I'll just hold off on that. But the new Rutledge piece looks fantastic, and I've already been diving into it. So thank you so much for all of the work you do, both empirically, conceptually, and in praxis. So thank you, Carolyn.
Oh, thank you.